The hiss of static was the only victor in the room. On the main holographic display in the Carrier Air Wings Tactical Operations Center, the icon for Hunter 2 blinked a malevolent red. It was a wound on the map, a beacon of failure bleeding out over the jagged coast of Isla Perdida. Rain, thick as liquid steel, hammered against the hull of the USS Independence. A violent percussion accompanying the staccato bursts of a firefight played out over encrypted comms. They were pinned. 3 operators from the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, the best of the best, were trapped in a forgotten slip of rock and jungle by an enemy who wasn't supposed to be there, armed with systems that weren't supposed to exist in this hemisphere. Status now. Colonel Marcus Thorne's voice cut through the controlled chaos like a shard of glass. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the command console. He was a man carved from regulations, his entire career a testament to the unassailable logic of the mission brief. Today, the brief was in ashes. "Still pinned, sir," a young communications officer replied, his voice tight. "They're taking sustained fire from fortified positions. The SA-22 Greyhound system is active and networked. We lost Eagle 4 trying a high-altitude approach 30 minutes ago. The storm cell is moving faster than forecasted. Ceiling is dropping to 500 feet over the island. Visibility near 0 inch. Thorne's jaw clenched. An SA-22. A modern, mobile, terrifyingly effective surface-to-air missile system. Created a dome of death 50 kilometers wide. Flying over it was suicide. Flying into the storm was equally suicidal. Perfect trap. What about a sea-level insertion? Negative, Colonel. The coast is a nightmare of sea stacks and reefs. No boat can get within 5 clicks, and the storm surge would tear a SEAL delivery vehicle to pieces. The helo can't get in under the missile ceiling without getting shredded by the coastal winds. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the whip of the wind outside and the faint, desperate crackle from Hunter 2's radio. Every man in the room was a pilot, a planner, or an intelligence officer. They ran simulations in their heads, flipping through every page of the tactical playbook they had spent their lives memorizing. Every page was blank. In the back of the room, leaning against a bulkhead near the coffee station, Major Elena Rostova stood motionless. She was a recent transfer to the air group, an anomaly. She didn't have the easy swagger of the other fighter jocks. She was quiet, her gaze steady, her presence so unobtrusive that most of the men in the room had already forgotten she was there. Her flight suit was immaculate but devoid of the colorful, boastful patches the others favored. She was a ghost in their midst, her file thin on combat deployments but thick with jargon-heavy reports from Patuxent River, the Navy's test pilot school. To them, she wasn't a real pilot. She was a scientist with wings. She listened, her eyes fixed on the map. She saw the storm front, a churning wall of reds and yellows on the weather overlay. She saw the island, a jagged spine of volcanic rock. And she saw the canyon, a thin, almost invisible blue line snaking from the western shore toward the interior, a geographic scar the mission planners had dismissed as non-navigable. Her fingers twitched, a phantom motion of a joystick rolling left, a throttle pushing forward. She could feel the air, taste the salt, see the path. It was there, a suicidal, impossible, singular path. "Colonel," a voice, calm and low, sliced through the despair. Thorne turned, his irritation palpable. It was Rostova. She had moved from the back of the room, her steps silent. She pointed a single, steady finger at the holographic map. "There's a way. Underneath them." Thorne's gaze followed her finger to the faint blue line. He scoffed, a short, sharp bark of derision. "That's a riverbed canyon, Major. It's barely wider than a hornet's wingspan and it's a blind run. The charts say it's a box canyon ending 2 miles from their position." "The charts are wrong," Rostova said, her voice unwavering. "The satellite imagery is 10 years old. New thermal surveys show it opens into a basin half a click from the estimated coordinates of the SA-22's command vehicle. The storm will blind their long-range radar. If you go in at sea level, right off the deck, you can slip under the radar curtain and use the canyon for cover." A few of the other pilots exchanged smirks. It was the kind of plan a kid would draw on a napkin, a fantasy from a video game. Fly into a hurricane at 50 feet, navigate a blind canyon, and hope the map is wrong. One of the senior squadron leaders, Commander Sting Jackson, drawled. Easy day. Thorne's eyes narrowed into slits. He saw a rookie, a test pilot who had never faced a real missile launch, trying to play hero with a half-baked, reckless theory. He felt the collective weight of his command, the lives of Hunter II, and the ghost of Eagle 4's pilot on his shoulders. This was not the time for amateur hour. Major Rostova, your input is noted and dismissed. We do not fly on thermal survey hopes, and we certainly do not fly into Category 3 storms for fun. Go make sure your aircraft is ready for the post-storm reconnaissance mission. You can count seagulls. Leave the real planning to us. The dismissal was brutal, public. The condescending tone hung in the air, thick and choking. The smirks from the other pilots widened into grins. Rostova's face remained a mask of placid neutrality. No flicker of anger, no hint of humiliation. She simply held his gaze for a beat longer than was comfortable, a silent challenge that Thorne refused to acknowledge. Then she gave a crisp, formal nod. Yes, sir. She turned and walked out of the TOC, her footsteps once again swallowed by the ambient hum of the ship. Commander Jackson leaned toward Thorne. Good call, Colonel. Last thing we need is some hotshot test pilot trying to prove something and losing us another bird. Thorne grunted, his attention already back on the map, on the blinking red icon that pulsed like a dying heart. He was a good commander, a man who cared about his people, but his thinking was a fortress built of doctrine and procedure. And in that fortress, there were no doors for impossible ideas. He didn't see the quiet confidence in Rostova's eyes. He didn't register the utter certainty in her voice. He just saw a subordinate with a reckless, unsanctioned opinion. An opinion he had just swatted away like an annoying fly, unaware that it was the only lifeline he had been offered. Outside, the storm raged, and on the island, the clock for Hunter II was running out. The walk from the TOC to the hangar bay was a descent into a different world. The sterile, climate-controlled quiet of command gave way to the visceral reality of the carrier. The air grew thick with the smell of jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and salt. The deck plates vibrated with the deep, resonant thrum of the ship's engines, a constant reminder of the Leviathan's power. Rostova moved through the narrow passageways with an economy of motion, her thoughts already shifting from the hostile environment of the briefing room to the familiar sanctuary of her aircraft. She emerged into the cavernous expanse of the hangar bay. It was a cathedral of controlled chaos. Yellow shirt plane directors guided tractors towing ordnance. Green shirts scrambled over airframes, and the roar of pneumatic tools echoed off the steel walls. Her jet, number 401, was tucked away in a corner, looking slightly out of place among the newer, more decorated F divided by a -18s of the frontline squadrons. It was an older Super Hornet, a hand-me-down from a fleet unit, its gray paint weathered by years of punishing carrier landings and exposure to the corrosive sea air. But to a discerning eye, it was perfect. Sergeant Ben Carter, her crew chief, was already there, running a diagnostic check on the port engine. He was young, barely 23, with a face that hadn't yet learned to hide his enthusiasm. Unlike the pilots, he held Rostova in a kind of quiet awe. He saw the way she treated the aircraft not as a tool but as a partner. He saw the meticulous nature of her pre-flight inspections, the way she'd run her hand over a control surface, feeling for imperfections no sensor could detect. "Everything good, Sergeant?" she asked, her voice pulling him from the datapad in his hand. "Yes, ma'am," he said, snapping to attention. "Ran the full systems check. She's green across the board. Just waiting on the ordnance load for the recon mission tomorrow." Rostova nodded, her eyes already scanning the airframe. She started her walk around, a ritual that was both methodical and deeply personal. Her touch was light as she ran her gloved fingers along the leading edge of the wing, her gaze sharp as she inspected the hydraulic actuators in the wheel well. Carter watched her, fascinated. Other pilots did their walk-arounds in 2 minutes, a cursory glance to satisfy the checklist. Major Rostova took 15. She checked every rivet, every seam, every sensor. As she reached the cockpit ladder, her hand paused on a small, faded marking just below the canopy rail. It was a stylized raptor, a peregrine falcon in a dive. Its wings swept back into a sharp delta. The paint was almost gone, weathered away to a pale ghost. Carter had always been curious about it. It wasn't a standard squadron marking. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what's that?" He gestured toward the emblem. Rostova looked at the faded paint. For a moment, her stoic expression softened, a flicker of memory in her eyes. "My grandfather flew birds with sharper wings than this one," she said, her voice quiet. It wasn't a full answer, but it was more than she usually offered about her past. The ghost of the emblem was a link to a lineage of flight, to a man who flew experimental Soviet MiGs before defecting, a man who taught her that the sky had rules, but a true pilot knew when and how to break them. The falcon was his symbol. Now it was hers. She climbed the ladder and settled into the cockpit. The cramped space was her domain. Her hands moved with practiced certainty, flipping switches, testing controls. The cockpit came to life around her, screens flickering on, the low hum of the avionics filling the space. She strapped herself in, pulling the harnesses tight until the jet felt like an extension of her own body. This was where the world made sense. There was no scorn here, no politics, no skepticism. There was only the machine, the mission, and the pilot. Cause and effect. Action and reaction. Carter, standing on the deck below, got a new directive on his datapad. "Change of ordnance for 401, he read aloud, frowning. "They're swapping the recon pod for 2 GBU-38s and a full cannon load." "What's that about, ma'am?" Rostova looked down from the cockpit, her face illuminated by the green glow of the head-up display. She didn't answer his question directly. "Sergeant," she said, her voice now stripped of all warmth, replaced by a cold, professional edge. "I need you to verify the integrity of the inertial navigation system, manually, then triple-check the pressure seals on the canopy. We're expecting some weather." Carter's eyes widened slightly. Manually verifying the INS was a long, tedious process usually reserved for major overhauls. Triple-checking the canopy seals was unheard of. He understood immediately. This wasn't about a recon mission tomorrow. This was about something else. Something now. Something that required a perfectly calibrated machine. "Right away, ma'am," he didn't question it. He saw the look in her eyes. It was the same look he'd seen in the eyes of veteran pilots heading into harm's way. It was the look of absolute, terrifying focus. He turned to get his tools, a sense of dread and excitement warring within him. The hangar bay was loud and chaotic, but around Jet 401, a pocket of intense, silent preparation had formed. Back in the TOC, the situation had deteriorated. Thorne had ordered another attempt, a desperate plan involving 2F divided by a -18S launching standoff missiles from the very edge of the SA-22's engagement envelope, hoping to saturate its defenses. The plan failed spectacularly. The Greyhound's sophisticated fire control radar tracked both missiles and the launch aircraft simultaneously. One missile was destroyed, the other decoyed. The two Hornets were forced to break off, defensive flares blooming behind them as they ran for their lives. The red icon for Hunter 2 continued its grim, steady pulse. "They're taking casualties, sir," the comms officer reported, his voice strained. "Hunter 2 Bravo is hit. They're requesting immediate evac, any means necessary. They say they can't hold for more than 30 minutes. Thorne slammed his fist on the console. He was out of options. Every conventional tactic had failed. Every by-the-book solution had been countered. He was a man trapped in a box of his own making, and 3 of his best operators were about to die because of it. His mind flashed back to Rostova's words, to the map, to the faint blue line of the canyon. A reckless, insane idea, a test pilot's fantasy. But it was the only idea left. He grabbed the internal comm receiver. "Get me Major Rostova." "Sir," the officer replied, his eyes wide as he looked at a secondary display showing flight deck operations. "She's already on the elevator." Thorne's blood ran cold. He raced to the window overlooking the flight deck. Below, through the driving rain, he saw it. Hornet 401, sleek and menacing, was being positioned on Catapult 2. It was loaded for a strike mission. Unauthorized. Unsanctioned. A flagrant breach of every protocol he held sacred. For a moment, pure rage surged through him. He was about to order the deck crew to stand down, to have her arrested. But then he looked back at the main screen at the blinking red light. 30 minutes. His hand tightened on the comm. His career, his entire way of thinking, screamed at him to stop her. But the lives of his men screamed louder. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of defeat and desperation. "All flight deck personnel," he said, his voice a low growl, raw with conflict. "Stand clear of Catapult 2. Launch the aircraft." He paused, then added, his voice barely a whisper, "God help you, Major." On the deck, Rostova received the launch clearance. There was no surprise in her. She had known it would come to this. She gave a final thumbs up to Sergeant Carter, who stood drenched in the rain, watching his perfectly tuned machine. The catapult officer gave the signal. With a deafening roar and a gut-wrenching lurch, Hornet 401 was thrown off the deck of the carrier and into the teeth of the storm. The transition from the solid deck to the violent air was instantaneous and brutal. One moment, she was locked in place. The next, she was a passenger in a 40,000-pound projectile hurled into a wall of gray chaos. The Super Hornet bucked and shuddered as it hit the storm front. Alarms blared in the cockpit: wind shear, proximity, altitude. She ignored them. Her hands were a blur on the stick and throttle, her inputs small, precise, instinctive. She wasn't fighting the storm. She was dancing with it. Instead of climbing, she pushed the nose down, hard. The carrier disappeared behind her as she dove toward the ocean. The radar altimeter screamed a continuous, piercing tone as the waves, monstrous and black, reached up for her. 50 feet, 40, 30. She leveled out at 20 feet, the tips of the churning waves seeming to lick at the belly of her jet. Salt spray peppered the canopy, a constant, blinding barrage that the wipers fought a losing battle against. Flying this low, this fast, was an exercise in pure madness. The air was thick and turbulent, a physical thing that tried to rip the wings from the fuselage. Every gust was a hammer blow. The jet groaned in protest, the airframe flexing under stresses it was never designed to endure. In the TOC, her icon on the main display flickered, then vanished. "Signal lost," the comms officer yelled. "She dropped below the radar horizon." "Of course she did," Thorne muttered, his eyes glued to the screen, his face a mask of disbelief. He had expected her to try and skirt the storm, to find a weak spot. He had not expected her to dive headfirst into its angriest heart, to disappear completely off the grid. He felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He had just sent a pilot to her death. But Rostova was not dead. She was more alive than she had ever been. In her cockpit, the world had shrunk to the green glow of the HUD and the feel of the machine beneath her. Her breathing was slow and even, a steady rhythm against the chaos outside. She wasn't flying by sight. There was nothing to see but a wall of water and fury. She was flying by instinct, by the data streaming into her helmet-mounted display, and by the memory of the map burned into her mind. The jet's advanced flight control system was screaming, trying to autocorrect, trying to pull her up to a safe altitude. She overrode it, her inputs firm and unwavering. She was in control, not the computers. For 10 agonizing minutes, she was a ghost. She raced across the waves, a gray specter hidden in the storm's belly, completely invisible to the enemy's powerful long-range radar. The SA-22 was blind to her approach, its operators searching the skies thousands of feet above, completely unaware of the threat screaming towards them just above the wave tops. Then, through a momentary break in the rain, she saw it. A dark gash in a cliff face, the mouth of the canyon. It appeared and disappeared in the deluge, a fleeting glimpse of salvation. She banked the Hornet, a graceful, impossible turn that bled speed but aligned her perfectly. She pulled back slightly on the stick, lifting the jet just enough to clear the rocky shore, and plunged into the narrow fissure. The moment she entered the canyon, the world changed. The roar of the open storm was replaced by a new sound. The shriek of compressed air as her jet, traveling at over 500 knots, displaced the very atmosphere in the narrow passage. The canyon walls were a blur of wet, black rock. So close she felt she could reach out and touch them. The ceiling of storm clouds above trapped the sound, turning the canyon into a deafening echo chamber. Her radar icon reappeared on the TOC's main screen, a single, defiant green, tracing the path of the canyon. A collective gasp went through the room. "My God!" Commander Jackson whispered, his earlier arrogance gone, replaced by pure shock. "She's actually doing it." Thorne stared, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. It wasn't a video game. It was real. Rostova's focus narrowed further. She was no longer just a pilot. She was a part of the jet, her senses extended to the wingtips, her thoughts translating directly into motion. The canyon twisted and turned, a serpent spine carved through the island. She rolled the Hornet onto its side to slip through a narrow constriction, the wingtip clearing the rock by mere feet. Ahead, her threat display lit up. A new signal, a short-range search radar, the eyes of the Greyhound system sweeping the canyon mouth. It was positioned exactly where her thermal survey data had predicted. The enemy was smart. They had covered the obvious aerial approaches, but they had also guarded this back door, never believing anyone would be insane enough to use it. She had one chance to blind them before they could sound the alarm. Her thumb moved to the weapon's pickle switch. She designated the target on her HUD, a small diamond locking onto the radar signature. The canyon opened slightly, giving her a precious few seconds of a clear line of sight. "Fox 3, she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. It was the wrong terminology for the weapon she was using, a habit from air-to-air training, but the sentiment was the same. She squeezed the trigger. A single GBU-38 bomb dropped from the pylon under her wing. It wasn't a fire-and-forget weapon. It was a GPS-guided munition, and in this canyon, with the storm overhead, the GPS signal was weak and unreliable. But Rostova had anticipated this. As she released the weapon, she rolled the jet, using her own targeting pod to laze the target, painting it with a beam of invisible light for the bomb seeker to follow. It was a maneuver that required impossible stability in the turbulent air. In the TOC, they saw the tiny icon of the bomb separate from her aircraft. They watched it trace a perfect arc. On the ground, at the SA-22 command post, a radar operator saw a flicker of a contact low and fast in the canyon. He reached for his comm switch to alert the missile crews, but he was too late. The bomb struck the mobile radar vehicle with surgical precision. The explosion was a contained, violent flash of light that ripped the vehicle apart, sending a plume of black smoke billowing into the gray, rain-soaked sky. In the enemy command center, the main radar display went black, replaced by a screen of useless static. They were blind. A cheer erupted in the TOC. It was a raw, primal sound of relief and disbelief. Thorne didn't cheer. He just stared at the screen, at the single green dot of Hornet 401 continuing its path up the canyon. The first impossible act was complete. She had kicked the door down. But now, everyone inside the house was awake and angry. The hardest part was just beginning. The silence on the enemy comms net lasted only seconds before it was replaced by panicked, overlapping shouts. The destruction of their primary search radar had thrown their entire air defense network into chaos. They were a decapitated beast, thrashing in confusion. But they were not dead. Rostova knew the local commanders would react, falling back on secondary protocols. The beast would grow new heads. Her threat display confirmed it. New signals flickered to life all around her. Not long-range missiles, but short-range, optically guided anti-aircraft guns and shoulder-fired manpads. They were positioned along the ridges of the canyon, activated by sentries who had seen or heard her passage. The canyon had gone from being her cover to being her coffin. Red triangles bloomed on her HUD, each one a gunner aiming at her. "Valkyrie, this is Thorne?" His voice crackled in her ear. The sound tinny and distant, but a vital link to the outside world. The formality was gone. He was no longer Colonel Thorne, the dismissive commander. He was just a voice in the dark, trying to help. They're waking up. I'm seeing multiple heat signatures popping up along the ridgeline, your vector. They're anticipating your exit from the basin. Copy, was all she said. Her eyes scanned the terrain ahead, her mind processing Thorne's intel and cross-referencing it with the canyon's topography. The box canyon was a lie. As the thermal data had suggested, it opened up into a wide, bowl-shaped basin, a hidden valley in the island's center. Hunter 2's position was on the far side, but the basin was now a kill box. Simultaneously, a new, more urgent warning blared. 2 bandits airborne. Thorne's voice was sharp. 2 Su-35s, scrambling from the airfield on the eastern side of the island. They're blind, no radar guidance, but they're heading for the basin. They'll be on top of you in 90 seconds. The equation had changed. It was no longer just a strike mission. It was now a race and a dogfight in a phone booth. She burst out of the canyon mouth and into the basin. The space felt vast after the claustrophobia of the rock walls, but she knew it was a deadly illusion. She was exposed. The entrenched infantry positions guarding Hunter 2 opened up on her immediately. Tracers, like angry red hornets, reached for her aircraft. She jinked left, then right, the G-forces pressing her into her seat. She could see the pinned-down operators, huddled behind a rock outcropping, returning fire. Valkyrie, bandits are at your 6 o'clock. Low, entering the basin now. Thorne's voice was a lifeline of information. She glanced at her rearview check sights. 2 sleek, powerful shapes, the unmistakable outlines of the Sukhoi flankers, were screaming in behind her, their cannons already winking. She was out of room. The basin walls were too high to climb over without presenting a perfect target for the gunners on the ridges. The flankers were more maneuverable and had a better thrust-to-weight ratio. In a conventional turning fight, they would eat her alive. Her mind worked with chilling clarity, discarding every standard defensive maneuver. There was no standard solution here. She needed something from the edge of the envelope, a page from a book no one else had read. She thought of her grandfather, the test pilot. He used to say, "An aircraft will tell you what it can do, if you're willing to listen when it screams." She pushed the throttle to the firewall, accelerating directly towards the far wall of the basin. The lead flanker pilot, seeing this, assumed she was making a desperate suicidal run. He closed the distance, confident, preparing for a kill shot. Then Rostova did something that defied the laws of combat aviation. Instead of trying to turn or climb, she pulled back hard on the stick while simultaneously slamming the right rudder pedal to the floor and rolling the jet left. It was a high G, rudder-reversed barrel roll, a violent, disorienting maneuver used in airshows, not in combat. It was designed to trade altitude and airspeed for a sudden change in position, but in the tight confines of the basin, it was insane. The Super Hornet screamed in protest. The G-forces hit her like a physical blow, blurring her vision, the blood draining from her head. The airframe shuddered violently, threatening to tear itself apart. The lead enemy pilot watched in utter disbelief as the American jet seemed to tumble out of control, rolling sideways while its nose pitched up, its forward momentum bleeding off catastrophically. He overshot her in a fraction of a second. But it wasn't an uncontrolled tumble. It was a precisely executed act of controlled chaos. As the flanker flashed past, Rostova completed the roll. Her Hornet, now at the edge of a stall, its nose pointed almost straight up, was directly behind and above the second pursuer. The Russian pilot had no time to react. He was looking at where she had been, not where she was. Her thumb found the weapon select switch, choosing the M61 Vulcan cannon. A low growl filled the cockpit as the gun spun up. A stream of 20mm rounds, bright and deadly, tore across the short distance and stitched a perfect line across the flanker's right wing and engine. The Sukhoi shuddered, its engine exploding in a ball of orange flame. It cartwheeled into the basin floor, a spectacular, fiery wreck. The lead flanker pilot, realizing his mistake, tried to pull into a high G-turn to re-engage. But Rostova was already gone. She had used the apex of her maneuver to dive back towards the ground, regaining speed, once again becoming a fleeting, unpredictable target. In the TOC, the room was utterly silent. They had watched the entire maneuver on her gun camera feed. Commander Jackson was pale, his mouth slightly agape. That's not in any manual," he stammered. Thorne didn't speak. He just watched the screen, his last shred of skepticism vaporizing in the fireball of the destroyed flanker. He was no longer commanding a subordinate. He was witnessing a master at work. The rookie test pilot was a phantom, an artist painting with violence and physics, and her canvas was the sky. The remaining flanker, its wingman gone and its target a ghost, broke off the engagement, climbing out of the basin to reassess. The immediate air threat was gone. Now it was just her and the men on the ground. With the sky temporarily hers, Rostova's mission shifted. The remaining flanker was a problem for later. The men of Hunter 2 were the priority. The extraction helicopter, Lifeline 1, was holding 5 miles out, waiting for a window. She had to create it. "Hunter 2, this is Valkyrie," she broadcast on their frequency, her voice a calm anchor in the storm of combat. "I'm on station. Mark your friendlies." A puff of purple smoke bloomed from behind the rock outcropping where the SEALs were pinned. The enemy positions, dug into the treeline on the opposite side of a small clearing, immediately concentrated their fire on the smoke. It was a fatal mistake. "Solid copy on the smoke," Rostova confirmed. "Keep your heads down." She rolled her Hornet inverted and pulled into a dive, plummeting towards the clearing. The world turned upside down, the green earth above her, the gray sky below. From this angle, she had a perfect view of the enemy trenches. They were well camouflaged, but the muzzle flashes gave them away. She lined them up in her sights. Her thumb depressed the trigger for the cannon. The Vulcan roared to life, a sound that the operators on the ground would later describe as the most terrifying and beautiful noise they had ever heard. It wasn't a spray-and-pray pass. It was surgical. A stream of high-explosive incendiary rounds, 1,000 per second, walked a precise line just in front of the SEAL's position, chewing up the earth and shredding the enemy trench. Dirt, rock, and shrapnel erupted into the air. The incoming fire slackened instantly. She pulled out of the dive, the G's pinning her to her seat, and climbed, banking hard for another pass. "Lifeline 1, the LZ is getting prepped," she transmitted. "Start your inbound run. I'll keep them busy." "Copy, Valkyrie. Inbound." The Hello pilot's voice was tight with tension. Rostova made 3 more passes. Each one was a masterpiece of precision and aggression. On the second pass, she targeted a heavy machine gun nest that was suppressing the SEAL's right flank, silencing it with a short, brutal burst. On the third, she saw a team of enemy soldiers attempting to flank the operator's position through a shallow creek bed. She dropped low, her jet's shadow flashing over them a second before her cannon fire turned their cover into a geyser of mud and water. From the ground, it was a display of raw, controlled power. The SEALs, men accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any fight, could only watch in awe. The Hornet was a gray demon, appearing and disappearing in the mist, its cannon speaking in a language of pure destruction. The pilot was an avenging angel, her wrath directed with scalpel-like precision. "TOC, this is Hunter 2 lead." The team leader's voice came over the command channel, breathless and filled with a raw, astonished respect. "LZ is secure. I say again, LZ is secure. Lifeline is on approach. Whoever that pilot is, buy them a bar. The whole damn bar." The black bulk of the MH-60 Black Hawk swept into the basin, its rotors whipping the rain into a frenzy. It touched down in the clearing Rostova had carved out, its door gunners providing covering fire. The 2 uninjured SEALs dragged their wounded teammate aboard. The entire extraction took less than 30 seconds. As the helicopter lifted off, its nose dipping as it gathered speed, the surviving enemy soldiers rallied for one last, desperate act. A soldier rose from a spider hole Rostova had missed, a manpad launcher on his shoulder. He had a clear lock on the slow-moving helicopter. Missile launch! Missile launch! 9 o'clock to the hello! One of the door gunners screamed over the radio. Rostova, who had been circling high to watch the extraction, saw it instantly. She had no time to get a weapon lock. The missile was already in the air. Without hesitation, she did the one thing she could. She put her aircraft between the missile and the helicopter. She rolled her Hornet and Dove, pushing the throttle past the firewall into emergency power. Her target wasn't the missile. It was the space in front of it. She punched her countermeasures button, sending a brilliant shower of incandescent flares blooming behind her jet. The heat-seeking missile, looking for the hottest object in the sky, momentarily lost its lock on the helicopter's engine exhaust and swerved towards the brighter, more intense heat of the flares. It was enough. The missile detonated harmlessly 100 yards behind the Black Hawk. "Lifeline is clear. They're clear!" the door gunner shouted, his voice cracking with relief. Rostova didn't acknowledge. She was already banking away, her mission complete. Hunter 2 was safe. She had done what they all thought was impossible. She had flown into the storm, navigated the abyss, and plucked 3 men from the jaws of death. Now all she had to do was get home. The tension in the TOC, which had been stretched to a breaking point, finally snapped. The room exploded in shouts and applause. Men were clapping each other on the back, their faces lit with the pure, unadulterated joy of a victory snatched from the jaws of certain defeat. They had been spectators to a miracle. Amid the celebration, Thorne stood frozen, his eyes still locked on the main screen where Hornet 401, a lone green symbol, was now heading back out to sea. The rescued SEAL team leader's voice came over the command channel again, filled with a weary, profound gratitude. "TOC, Hunter 2 is en route to the boat. All personnel accounted for. I have to ask, who is that angel?" The question hung in the air, silencing the room. All eyes turned to the young communications officer who had been tracking Rostova's flight. He was looking at her personnel file on a secondary screen, his expression one of dawning wonder. Thorne had glanced at that file earlier, dismissing it as the thin record of a non-combat pilot. Now he realized he hadn't read it closely enough. "That's Major Elena Rostova, sir," the officer said, his voice quiet but carrying across the suddenly silent room. "Call sign, Valkyrie." The name landed with the force of a physical blow. Valkyrie. It wasn't just a call sign. It was a legend, a ghost story whispered in the halls of naval aviation and the black-budget world of weapons development. A few of the older pilots in the room, including Commander Jackson, shifted uncomfortably. They knew the story. A few years ago, a multi-billion-dollar prototype, the Navy's next-generation stealth fighter, suffered a catastrophic flight control failure during a high-altitude test. The chase planes were ordered to break away, and the pilot was told to eject. The aircraft was considered lost, but the pilot refused. For 17 minutes, flying on raw skill and manual overrides, the pilot wrestled the unstable aircraft back from the edge of oblivion, landing it on a dry lakebed with the landing gear only partially deployed. The pilot saved the entire program from a decade-long setback. The official report was heavily redacted, the pilot's name classified to avoid embarrassing the defense contractor. But the engineers and test pilots who witnessed it gave the anonymous hero a name: Valkyrie. Thorne felt a chill run down his spine. He strode over to the comms officer's station and looked at the screen himself. There it was, in a heavily classified addendum to her file that he now had the authority and the reason to open. A single line: Incident XF-44A. Pilot awarded Distinguished Flying Cross. Classified. Recommended callsign Valkyrie by Navarre Test Directorate. He looked closer at her family history. Father, Anatoly Rostova, renowned aerodynamicist. Grandfather, Colonel Ivan Rostov, legendary Soviet test pilot who defected in the 1980s with a prototype MiG-29, bringing with him a wealth of knowledge on unorthodox flight maneuvers, what he called edge-of-the-envelope artistry. It all clicked into place. Her quiet confidence, her dismissal of their conventional thinking. The fated falcon on her jet. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't recklessness. It was lineage. It was mastery. She wasn't just a pilot. She was the scion of a dynasty of aviators who lived and breathed the outer limits of flight. Thorne had laughed at her. He had dismissed a living legend as a rookie. The shame was a cold, heavy weight in his chest. "Get me a fleet-wide weather update," Thorne ordered, his voice hoarse, "and clear the deck for an emergency landing. Valkyrie is coming home." His tone was different now. The name was no longer just a call sign. It was a title. It was a recognition. The ghost of Patuxent River had just been given flesh and blood over Isla Perdida. The return flight was a quiet affair. The storm, having spent its fury, was beginning to break apart. Shafts of pale sunlight pierced the clouds, illuminating a sea that was slowly calming from black rage to a slate-gray swell. Rostova flew on autopilot, the jet humming contentedly around her. Her body ached from the strain of the G-forces. Her mind was weary from the intense concentration, but a deep sense of calm had settled over her. The job was done. She followed the carrier's recovery beacon. Soon, the immense gray shape of the USS Independence materialized out of the haze. She completed her pre-landing checklist, her actions smooth and economical. She lowered her landing gear and tailhook, the familiar thumps and clunks echoing in the cockpit. She called the tower, her voice betraying no emotion. "Valkyrie inbound single engine, 5 miles, state 3. The lie about the single engine was a small courtesy, an excuse for the flight deck to give her priority and clear a path, though she knew she wouldn't need it. As she lined up on final approach, she noticed something unusual. The flight deck was crowded, but nobody was moving. The usual frantic ballet of plane handlers, ordnance crews, and maintenance technicians had ceased. They were all standing in neat rows watching her approach. It was a silent, unnerving audience. Her landing was flawless. She caught the third wire, the ideal target, with a jolt that was firm but not jarring. The tailhook disengaged, and she taxied her battered Hornet out of the landing area, the canopy still slick with salt and rain, the airframe bearing the soot streaks of cannon fire. She brought the jet to a halt where a yellow shirt directed her, and began the shutdown sequence. The roar of the engine spooled down into a whine, then a hum, and finally silence. The only sounds were the wind whipping across the deck and the distant crash of waves against the hull. She unstrapped herself, the release of the harnesses feeling like an exhalation. She pushed the canopy open, and the cold, clean salt air washed over her. As she climbed down the ladder, Sergeant Carter was there, waiting. He didn't speak. He just looked at her. Then at the aircraft, his expression a mixture of reverence and awe. He reached out and gently placed a hand on the fuselage, as if to reassure himself it was real. Then she saw Colonel Thorne. He was standing at the edge of the yellow-shirt crowd, his formal cover tucked neatly under his arm. The entire flight deck crew, from the lowest-ranking airmen to the senior commanders, stood silently at attention. It was an unofficial, spontaneous, and deeply profound tribute. A silent honor guard. Rostova walked towards him, her boots clicking on the non-skid deck. She stopped a respectful distance away and waited. Thorne looked her in the eye. His face was unreadable, but the rigid certainty he had worn in the TOC was gone, replaced by something more complex, more human. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't offer words of praise, which would have felt cheap and inadequate. Instead, he raised his hand to his brow in a slow, deliberate salute. It was not the perfunctory gesture of a superior to a subordinate. It was a mark of profound respect, an admission of his error, and a recognition of her skill, paid in the currency of military tradition. Rostova's back straightened. She brought her own hand up, her salute as crisp and perfect as her landing. They held the position for a long moment, an entire conversation passing between them in the silent gesture. Then they lowered their hands in unison. Thorne gave a single, curt nod, then turned and walked away, leaving her alone on the deck. The spell was broken. The crews slowly returned to their duties, but their movements were quieter now, their glances toward her filled with a newfound respect. She was no longer the quiet transfer, the strange test pilot. She was Valkyrie. The name was now cemented in the carrier's soul. Rostova turned back to her jet. Hornet 401 sat cooling in the wind, the metal ticking softly as it contracted. The setting sun cast long shadows across the deck, glinting off the water-streaked canopy. She walked to the nose of the aircraft and placed her gloved hand on the ghost of the emblem, the faded peregrine falcon. The metal was still warm. She closed her eyes, feeling the faint vibrations of the ship's engines through the soles of her boots, the wind on her face, the quiet hum of the cooling avionics. She had not sought glory or recognition. She had simply done her job, followed the path only she could see. The dignity she carried was her own, earned not in a briefing room with words, but in a canyon of fire and wind with action. The sky was quiet, the legend was born, and in the silence there was peace.